Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our second annual webinar in recognition of Exposome Day. We established Exposome Day in 2022 to raise awareness about the field of exposomics. For those of you who are unfamiliar, exposomics is the study of how environmental factors interact across the lifespan to impact human health. To measure the vast number of unique exposures that we each experience over time, exposomics research employs novel strategies to measure and analyze a wide range of environmental exposures, things like air pollution, water quality, diet, physical activity, stress, and many other internal and external factors. Using these methods, scientists at the Institute for Exposomics Research can go back in time to understand how past exposures at different life stages lead to adverse health outcomes like autism, asthma, cancer, infertility, ALS, and many other conditions. The field of exposomics is relatively young, but thanks to technological advancements, it is evolving rapidly. Studying exposomics involves some of the most innovative, cutting-edge research techniques available today, which is why I'm sure you will find today's webinar fascinating. Mount Sinai, as a leader in environmental health for more than 60 years, is leading this groundbreaking research front. While a great deal of research has focused on how prenatal and early life exposures impact health, Exposomics is allowing us to more closely examine other critical periods of development, times in our lives when the body is most susceptible to environmental exposures. Today, in recognition of Exposome Day and Women's Health Month, we will learn about how the environment plays a role in shaping women's health, more specifically reproductive health over the age of 40, an area that until now has been largely overlooked. And as a result, very little is known about the links between the environment and health conditions associated with menopause and later life reproductive health in women. First, we'll hear from Dr. Rosalind Wright, an internationally recognized clinician scientist and epidemiologist, about the promise of exposomics research at uncovering the role of environment in health and disease and why it's so important to look at the environment in the context of women's health. Then, Drs. Ronit Mochtinger and Lauren Petrick will discuss opportunities for research and advancements in clinical care for women over the age of 40. We ask that you put any questions that you have for our panelists in the Q&A, and we'll bring back Drs. Mochtinger and Petrick to respond to as many of them as time permits. So Dr. Rosalind Wright is the co-director of the Mount Sinai Institute for Exposomic Research, Dean for Translational Biomedical Sciences, Program Director of the Clinical and Translational Science Award Program, and the Horace W. Goldsmith Professor in Life Course Health Research in the Departments of Pediatrics and Environmental Medicine and Public Health at Mount Sinai. Dr. Wright is internationally recognized as a clinician scientist and life course epidemiologist with transdisciplinary training in molecular biology, environmental health, social determinants, and stress mechanisms. Dr. Wright also directs the Physiological Assessment of Children's Environmental Risk, or PACER laboratory, which conducts research to better understand how our social environment modifies the effects of chemical toxicants. Dr. Wright, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's very exciting to be with you all today. I'm just going to pull up my slides. Make sure you're all seeing that. Do you see that in the slideshow?
Yes, but can you open it in the slideshow mode?
Is it opening? Looks okay on my screen.
Yep, that looks great.
Okay. So today I'm just going to start with a high-level discussion about the promise of exposomics in women's health research, and specifically try to get us to think about how we need to change our perspective and focus on windows of opportunity over a woman's life course to improve health through the implementation of exposomics, which you're going to hear more about directly from the other speakers. And I'm going to use a very specific example of exposure to hormones over a woman's life to exemplify some of the key ways that we need to change our perspective in the way we approach science. So over time, I know, and many of the women listening on the call may have experienced this in their own interactions with their healthcare providers over their life course. There's always been this multiple studies over the last several decades on hormone exposure over a woman's life and how it impacts her health, but often with conflicting results. For example, if you just take estrogen exposure, we know that over the context of a woman's life course, you're exposed differentially to the hormone estrogen based on what phase you are in your developmental stage. So it depends on a number of factors that women go through over the course of their development. So age, onset of menarche determines how long and how much you're exposed to estrogen. If you have earlier onset of menarche, for example, that may put you in a place where you're going to have that exposure longer term over the course of your life course. When you have your first pregnancy can affect this. How many pregnancies you may have or may not have over the course of your life course. And then as we're talking about here, as women get older and they go through perimenopause and menopause, the conversation starts with your doctor on hormone replacement therapy. Should you or should you not? Are there risks and benefits that you need to think about, et cetera? And it's not the same for every woman, and there's still a lot that we can learn for why that may be. And also, hormone replacement therapy or natural exposure to estrogen over the course of your life shapes not only your reproductive health, but it shapes a number of organ systems, cognitive functioning over the life course, respiratory disease risk over the life course, cardiovascular disease, et cetera. So why conflicting results, even though we've had decades of research on that, and what are we missing? Well, we need to consider lifetime experiences and exposures beyond natural hormone exposures or medications like oral contraceptive use or hormone replacement therapy at the time of menopause, for example. And we have to think about it at each critical life stage of a woman, which is just pictured here in this diagram with all the silhouettes. So our health is shaped not only by medicines, taking oral contraceptions, taking hormone replacement therapy at different stages of our life, but we know the exposome concept says we have to really consider more comprehensively the types of exposures and experiences that we have across our life course. And they're all pictured here. And this includes both chemical exposures like pesticides, personal care product exposures, et cetera, air pollution, but also psychological exposure, non-chemical exposures like stress. And then, of course, nutrition and diet can be other sources. So it gets more and more, the picture gets more complicated. So, example of lifetime exposure to stress and hormone exposure at a critical window in women's lives, pregnancy, for example. You can disrupt the hormone exposure that the woman experiences during pregnancy. Now, here's an example of just looking at one hormone at a time. And when we think about psychological stress, and as you heard in the introduction, stress and health is a big part of what I think about and do in my own research. We think about cortisol as the stress hormone. And this just shows you a paper we did almost a decade ago now, demonstrating that we can look at mom's lifetime exposure to cumulative stressors over the course of her lifetime, and measure the amount of cortisol that is produced during the pregnancy. Now that has implications for mom's health, reproductive outcomes in the mothers, but also for the infant that is developing therein. This also shows there's some differences based on race, ethnicity, but that's beyond what we're going to talk about today. But then there are other hormone disruptors besides medications moms might be on, besides psychosocial stress, and there are a number of hormone pathways. It's not just one single hormone at a time that gets disrupted that has implications. And we've shown this now in some recent work that we've done that looked at not only stress down there in the lower right-hand corner during pregnancy, cumulative lifetime stress in the mother, predicting not just estrogen disruption or cortisol disruption, but also a whole host of a number of hormone pathways that get disrupted in the mother carried into that pregnancy. And if we can understand that together more comprehensively using higher dimensional assays, as we do in exposomics, we can actually get a little closer to what the real story might be for a given individual. On the left-hand side, we show that it's not just things that we naturally think about disrupting hormones, like psychological stress or taking a hormone-disrupting medication that might alter the way that our bodies produce and develop hormone pathways. Air pollution has come to light more recently, very recently. This is the first study that actually looked at exposure to traffic-related pollution in an urban environment here in Manhattan, in the New York area surrounding Mount Sinai. We've recruited women in pregnancy, and we've measured both their air pollution exposure preconception in the communities in which they live, and then the hormone production during pregnancy. And you can see, again, multiple classes of hormones are disrupted by their exposure to traffic-related pollutants. And there are a whole host of chemical endocrine disruptors that one might take in through diet, one might take in through being exposed to things like pesticides and other chemicals in the environment. So what does this tell us? That maybe the conflicting information that's come from all the research that's gone into focusing on one medication use at a time, like hormone replacement therapy, or one chemical at a time, or one only focusing in on a single hormone, single outcome, or a biological biomarker of the implications of that to women's health. So sometimes we just need to step back and change our perspective, and that's really what Exposomics has really done. It says we need to not only understand a critical window of development. Here we're saying, well, how does the environmental exposures on the left-hand side of this cartoon affect women's physiology during pregnancy and how that relates to her subsequent long-term risk of things like respiratory health. Could be cardiovascular health, could be neurodevelopmental health, et cetera, reproductive health, whatever you want to look at on the right-hand side there. And what it says is we really got to go deep and measure in a much more comprehensive, high-dimensional way how that mother is biologically responding to numerous environmental factors at the same time. And so we really want to do that on a high-dimensional scale, and the next speakers will be talking to you about approaches being taken to do exactly that. And this is something I think of all the time. If you change the way you look at things, things you look at change. We are going to get new answers if we really invest and take an exposomic approach to the research that we do around numerous things, but women's health in particular is lacking this kind of science, and particularly at the life stage that we're talking about here today. We need to educate researchers and as well as healthcare providers to embrace the complexity and think together ways where we can actually translate this back so that doctors will be better able, when they're seeing a patient, to give direct tips to keep, and I'm staying with this idea of the hormones that we've been talking about today, but it's even much more broader than that. How do I talk to you about what it is that could help you optimize things to keep your hormone balance optimal so that your health over the rest of your life course, from the time that I'm seeing you now, continues to go on a very healthy trajectory. And that is exactly what we're going to be talking about with some of the approaches that we're taking, these new approaches, this new perspective on women's health research and science. And I'll just stop there and stop sharing and see if there are any questions before we move on to the other speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wright, for really clearly giving some examples of how we can use exposomics to study women's health. So we do have a few questions before we move on to our other panelists. And so the first one, I think, you really clearly set the stage for environment being involved in health across the lifespan. But there has been a huge focus and financial investment on looking at genetic causes of diseases, even though we know that environment plays a huge role in essentially every health outcome that we can study. So can you talk a little bit about the need for investments, both through government and private sources, to support this really important work?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, I started my own career focusing on genetics and health. When I was back in medical school, Francis Collins was one of the professors who was the former director of NIH at the University of Michigan, where I was training. That was going to be the answer. And I did a lot of work in genetics. And then I realized that it only explained a small part of what we were seeing happening, whether you're talking about women's health or chronic disease more broadly. And it became very evident, as it has to many of us over time, that it really was also environmental factors that are operating here. But it's the genes and the environment together that we really have to understand. Exposomics embraces that as well. It looks at not only your environmental exposures, but your genetic predisposition at the same time to those exposures that then put you at risk for particular diseases. So I may be at risk based on my genetics when I'm exposed to air pollution, stress, et cetera, to developing lung disease, but the person next to me may have more of a cardiovascular risk, for example. So that it is part of exposomics, absolutely, has to be. All that work that came before with genetics, genomics. Now, if we can really put it together with all that we've learned in environmental health, that's going to be exposomics, if that makes sense.
Thank you. So I didn't know that you started your career in genetics, but I did know that you are a pulmonologist by training. But you also hold an appointment in pediatrics. And today we're talking about women's health. So it seems that the environment is really sort of the common thread in thinking about all of these populations and health outcomes. And you talked a little bit about the need for physicians to consider environmental exposures when they're assessing their patients. So what do you tell clinicians who are focused on a subspecialty, women's health or cancer or geriatrics, to get them to think about the role of environment in their patients' health?
Actually, the best way to get a physician who's kind of been brought up in this biomedical model, right, of how environment might affect health is to show them the science. And the science is just growing and growing and growing. And a lot of it is education at this point. It's however you disseminate that information, starting as young as possible. Certainly this has to be in medical school curriculum. But when you go and give grand rounds or talk to clinicians and show them the data, that's the big part of it. Okay, now they know, oh, wow, this is something I need to be. Then they want to know, but what can I do about it? I'm a clinician. I have X amount of time with my patients, et cetera. We have to learn as well how to help them digest this information, take this to their patients and inform how they might change how they talk to patients about things. We're down that road. We are down that path, but we have a long ways to go. Especially when we're talking about exposomics and the big data that we're talking about now. But that's no different than how we talk to people about the big genetic data and translate that into health outcomes.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think that a lot can be learned from genetics and genetic counseling and how we talk about environment with patients. So I think that's a great point. And so you talked a little bit about stress, and also I know that you had a slide that showed some inequities in stress exposure by race. And so can you talk a little bit more about the health outcomes that you see in women who are exposed to early life stress, and maybe a little bit about the inequities that result?
Sure. We all know, everybody experiences stress. And on the other side of that is our ability to bring resources to bear to, buffer ourselves against that stress or protect ourselves against that stress. And when you think about socioeconomic disparities, people have fewer and fewer resources available. Not only they're experiencing more life stress, constant life stress, ongoing life stress, worrying about putting food on the table, right? Living in unsafe communities, these kinds of things. That's where it's going to get in the body and disrupt the biology that we were talking about, whether you're talking about that cortisol level in hair that can be measured, or more broadly, the hormone disruption that I was talking about earlier. So it does get under the skin, and it gets in the body. people who are most vulnerable are the ones who have multiple exposures to unhealthy environmental factors, whether it's psychological, chemical, or non-chemical stressors, and also don't have the resources to counter that in a way. So you see that play out, right? We see higher levels of poor perinatal outcomes, low birth weight, maternal mortality, even at the time around the reproductive period, which is, we can do something about it though. If we're going to really understand it though, we have to embrace that complexity like I'm talking about, I think, to make real headway. We've made some, we need to make more.
Thank you. So we have time to wrap up with one more question. So as you look broadly at the environment and women's health, what are the main gaps that you see in that research today?
I think that we need to take, some of the approaches and methodologies you're going to hear about from the other speakers. This is where we need to go. We need to be able to look at the big picture, the more comprehensive assessment of the environmental factors that we're interested in that might be getting in the body, but also how they disrupt how our bodies behave and function. And that translates to health. Because the closer we get to understanding what networks, not just one at a time, like just cortisol, but the whole picture is operating, we'll be able to actually identify risk, who's really at risk, and what can we do. The other gap is not only to understand the risks, but the resiliency factors. And there are many that we are also looking at in the context of exposomics. So you can actually offset a lot of chemical toxicities, psychological toxicity, with good healthy diet, et cetera, access to healthy foods, these kinds of things. Sounds simple, but that's a lever that we can pull. But there are others we could talk about, but that's one example. And then, how do we use this data to inform how do we get some of these toxins out of our environment at the same time that we're working with these other resiliency factors.
Great, thank you so much. We need to move on to our other speakers. There are questions that are coming in the Q&A, and we will hold those for our panelists at the end, and we'll have more time to talk about concrete steps that individuals can take to create a healthier environment as well. So with that, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Ronit Mokhtinger, a senior physician in the in vitro fertilization division at Sheba Hospital in Israel. She graduated from the Sackler Faculty of Medicine at Tel Aviv University and specializes in gynecology, obstetrics, and fertility at Sheba Medical Center. She completed a research fellowship at Brigham and Women's Hospital, Harvard Medical School, and the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. She returned to Israel to found a new laboratory in Sheba Medical Center studying the effects of the environment and BMI on reproduction and pregnancy outcomes. She's an associate professor at the School of Medicine at Tel Aviv University and a department associate with the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. In addition, Dr. Mokhtinger has published more than 80 peer-reviewed papers and serves as an associate editor of the journal Human Reproduction. So, Dr. Mokhtinger, I will turn it over to you.
So thank you very much for the opportunity to give this talk. I will share my screen. Update it again. Okay.
Looks good. Great.
Yes. So we will talk today about the environment, about menopausal transition, and about menopause. So when we're talking about female reproduction, I'm not sure that all of us know that actually a baby is born with the final number of oocytes that she's going to have. So the largest number of oocytes is after 20 weeks of gestation, and the number is 7 million. Then most of the oocytes are undergoing atresia, and actually at birth, a female baby is born with 2 million oocytes. So the number continued to decrease until puberty, which is about 400,000 oocytes. And then every month we lose dozens or even hundreds of oocytes until menopause. I start with this introduction because it's very important to understand the effect of the environment on our production potential. So there are several vulnerable stages for female reproduction, and the first one is the intrauterine period. So during the pregnancy, if a woman is exposed to several chemicals, for example, bisphenol A, phthalates, PFAS, and even several metals, so some of those chemicals can actually transfer the placenta and expose the fetus to their effects. With some of them, we're going to see only during childness or during adulthood. So for example, heavy metals as arsenic, cadmium, and lead are found in fruit juice. These toxic metals cross the placenta. You have to be aware of it. Phthalates are in hundreds of products, such as vinyl chlorine, personal care products like soaps, shampoos, and hairspray, and exposure to phthalates metabolites found in pregnant women is associated with 15% increase of having a preterm birth. Bisphenol A is another chemical which is produced in large quantities, primarily for production of plastics. And it is found in various products, including water bottles, epoxy resins that coats some of the metal cans and also bottle tops. And the primary source of exposure to bisphenol A to most of the people is through our diet. PFAS is another group of chemicals, those substances that have been used since the 1940s to make non-stick cookware, like Teflon, for example, and also can be found in food packaging, especially those that we use in the microwave, like popcorn. There are several vulnerable stages for exposure of oocytes and also women to those chemicals. The first one is in the fetal ovary during the first prophase. Then we have another step after the great atresia of the follicle, still in the fetal ovary. And the third step is during the completion of the first meiosis. This is in the adult ovary, which means every month during the time of ovulation. We know that women at the reproductive age that are exposed to several chemicals, we know that those chemicals can be associated with a decrease in women's fertility. For example, it has been found an association between pesticide residue that are intake from consumption of fruits and vegetables and pregnancy outcomes in women that underwent IVF. Patients that were exposed to pesticide at high levels during eating fruits and vegetables in IVF cohort showed lower fertilization rates, decreased number of high-quality embryos, and also an increased risk for miscarriages. Several talc metabolites were also associated with significantly fewer total and fertilized oocytes, as well as clinical pregnancy rates and live births among women at cohorts that underwent IVF. So this was what we know, just some examples of the effects of the environment during reproduction. But we have to move on and look at the menopausal transition. So menopausal transition, or what we call perimenopause, is the period that links a woman's reproductive childbearing age and menopause. So this transition is usually experienced by women between 40 and 50 age of life. And it can, it is usually between 3 and 7 years, and characterized by gradual loss of oocytes and wide hormonal fluctuation, specifically the estrogen, and irregular menstrual patterns. So we discriminate between two stages of menopausal transition. We have the early transition, in which we see a small increase in the prevalence of menopausal symptoms, and the perturbation of the menopausal cycles is minimal. So usually women experience cycles that are around 7 days more or less than they usually have. As well as we know that the early transition is of variable duration. In this stage of the early transition, so the hormones in the ovary do compensation. That's why usually the symptoms are not so prevalent, although we can see them. However, later on, we do have the later transition of perimenopause, and there is an evidence of estrogen defects, and we see increased symptoms and increased bone mineral loss. Usually those patients that are at this stage tell that they skip about 2 cycles or more, and this stage usually lasts approximately from 1 to 3 years. During the menopausal transition, around 70 or 80% of the patients will suffer from estrogen deficit symptoms, which can be either vasomotor symptoms, mood disorders, temporary cognitive dysfunction, genitourinary symptoms, weight gain, specifically abdominal fat, and increase in other disease processes. All of those reduce the quality of life of affected women. Talking about the vasomotor symptoms, so usually we're talking about hot flashes and night sweats that are the most common, and about 80% of the women will have those symptoms. It can be easy, it can be more complicated, but most of them will have it. And those symptoms, the vasomotor symptoms, can last for 10 years. So there are several factors that were found to be related to the high occurrence and severity of those symptoms, and they include obesity, cigarette smoking, and also high levels of anxiety or depression. Mood disorders are also very frequent among women at the perimenopause or menopausal transition. And the risk for having any major depressive episode during the perimenopause is 2 to 5-fold higher than compared with younger patients. Usually those mood disorders tend to decline after menopause. Sleep disturbance also disturb about 15% of the women at the perimenopause or the menopause transition time. And it's very common And we know that patients that have also vasomotor symptoms and hormonal changes in obesity have higher frequency for sleep disturbances. Just yesterday in the New York Times, there was a paper talking about mammography, that in the last years, the guidelines were to do mammography only after the age of 50. And as there was an increase of 2% in the frequency of breast cancer, so the guidelines were changed. And today it seems that every woman that is 40 or more has to do a screening mammography for breast cancer. The environment is really related to menopausal transition. Most of the research today is about the intrauterine exposures and IVF and reproduction, and not a lot about what happens in the menopause and perimenopause. But current studies have shown that smoking increased the likelihood of entry to each menopausal stage, and it is consistently associated with an earlier stage of menopause, earlier age of menopause, between 1 and 3 years for those who smoke compared with those who are no smokers. Menopause is the final stage of ovarian physiology, and in women, it reflects time of the final oocyte depletion and loss of gonadal steroids, the very low levels of estrogens. So we define menopause if a woman has at least 1 year without menstrual cycles, and the average age for menopause globally is almost 49. So what do we see in menopause? Actually, very little of estrogen is produced, so we don't have no ovulation. The progesterone also is not produced, so we don't have periods, and also the uterine lining doesn't thicken. So usually we see a very thin endometrium during ultrasound checkups. Premature menopause occurs if a woman doesn't get her periods more than 1 year before she is 40 years old. We define early menopause if it occurs before the age of 45, and there is very little geographic variation in the age of menopause. We know that about 10% of the women will experience menopause before the age of 45 years. As the life expectancy today, the mean one is 81 years old, so it means that we will have about 40% of our lives in menopause or post-menopause. A woman's age at menopause really influences her ill health outcomes in later life. So what we know today is that later age of natural menopause has been linked to a longer life expectancy, higher bone mineral density and lower risk of fracture, reduced mortality, and reduced cardiovascular disease and death from cardiovascular disease. However, later menopause is associated with greater risk for breast cancer, especially in obese women, and also an increased risk for ovarian cancer. Several factors are associated with the age of menopause. One of it is genetic, the other one is lifestyle, and the third one is environment. So what do we know about genetics? We know that the age of natural menopause is hereditary, and it is affected something like 50% at the age of the mother. So if the mother had late menopause, very good chances that also the daughter will have late menopause. Same is about very early or premature menopause. Looking about lifestyles, so we know for sure that cigarette smoking has been consistently associated with premature and early menopause. And of course, we recommend to have healthy lives, as Dr. Wright said before. Also, the environment. We know today that sleep disruption in menopausal women is associated with exposure to several chemicals, and also that air pollution speeds the osteoporosis in postmenopausal women. So thank you for this section.
Thank you so much, Dr. Machtinger. We're going to turn now to hear from Dr. Petrick. So Dr. Petrick, oops, sorry, I lost my screen for a second. Sorry about that. Dr. Petrick is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Medicine and Public Health and the head of the Untargeted Metabolomics Laboratory in the Senator Frank R. Lautenberg Environmental Health Sciences Lab at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. She holds an additional faculty appointment at Sheba Medical Center in Israel and is an analytical chemist with advanced training in metabolomics and exposomics. Her current work focuses on the development of untargeted methods for matrices such as archived neonatal dried blood spots that allow us to go back in time to directly measure early life exposures and to establish whether metabolomic and exposomic signatures exist around the time of birth that predict later life disease. These assays capture both the external and the internal exposome and allow for early detection of disease risk, targeted health monitoring, and early interventions. So Dr. Petrick, I will turn it over to you.
You're on mute. Sorry about that. I did not turn on my stuff before I moved out of the Zoom. So can everyone hear me and see me?
We can see your slides. Yep, you're good.
Wonderful. Okay. So thank you so much for having me here today. You just heard from my colleague who's a physician, and now you're going to hear from me. So as for the introduction, I'm Lauren Petrick, and my training and research are in analytical chemistry. So really from the laboratory side, where I think about chemicals and how to measure them inside and outside our bodies and how they interact with our biology. So recently, I've become very interested in the role of environment on women's health because there's this growing body of evidence that suggests that a range of toxicants may adversely affect several important women's reproductive and longevity outcomes. We do know that reproductive aging dramatically impacts women's health. Half of postmenopausal women develop osteoporosis, more than double the rate of men, and menopause quadruples the risk for a cardiovascular event. So while the consequences of reproductive aging are quite profound, we don't understand the most basic things about it. What sets it in motion, why it varies so much between individuals, or what can exacerbate reproductive aging. And we know very little about how environmental exposures affect later life reproductive health and the menopause transition. So nevertheless, these effects on reproductive health could be critical. So we know that this transition is associated with these later types of pathologies. So in addition, many of the symptoms of menopause happen earlier than most women expect. When I started this journey into research on the menopause transition, I came across this study that I found really compelling. These researchers wanted to create a clearer understanding of the 10 to 15 years leading up to the final menstrual period, which are currently poorly understood and can be difficult for many women. So they posted a survey online in English and Spanish and asked women ages 35 to 55 to complete this 82-question online survey. And the survey asked questions about their menstrual cycles and the symptoms sometimes associated with the menopause transition, as well as their frequency and degree of bother. And then in the last part asked how much these symptoms interfere with their lives. And the symptoms covered sleep interruption, vasomotor symptoms like hot flashes, mood changes, headache, and brain fog, and others. And after 6 months, they had collected survey data on over 1,400 women, mostly from the US, but also Canada, Mexico, New Zealand, and others. So they had this broad geographic range of participation. And 2/3 of the women were defined as late reproductive stage, or LRS, where they did not observe major irregularities in their menstrual cycles in the last 3 months. And then 1/3 were defined as going through that menopausal transition. And what they found was surprising to me, and surprising to those who took the survey, and it's that the late reproductive stage women were suffering from symptoms to almost the same degree as those going through the menopause transition. When they examined the proportion of these LRS women reporting symptoms, they found that more than 40% indicated sort of this long list of symptoms, from sleep problems to increased anxiety, dry skin, and fatigue. And so this suggests that women are experiencing symptoms and therefore biological changes years before they even observe changes in their menstrual periods. So changes are happening much earlier. So another important outcome is menopausal timing, and the timing of the final menstrual period can have important clinical and health implications. And I don't need to mention these again because Ronit just mentioned them, but it really suggests that there's several, so what menopause is a universal phenomenon among women, the symptoms, the timing of menopause, the duration of the transition are unique to individuals. And this suggests that there's several factors that play a role in women's reproductive health, including genetics, lifestyle factors, psychosocial and environmental factors. So even though menopause affects 50% of the population, there's a dearth of studies that have investigated these factors. Nevertheless, there are several large-scale studies. This includes the Study of Women's Health Across the Nation, or SWAN, the Women's Health Initiative, or WHI, and others that have been providing us with important information regarding some potential chemicals that can be adversely affecting women's menstrual cycle regularity, menopausal timing, ovarian health, uterine health, menopausal symptoms, and these postmenopausal pathologies. So in the next few slides, I'll share some of these findings. So Ronit mentioned PFAS chemicals, and there's several studies that have shown that different PFAS chemicals can disrupt normal reproductive function in women. PFAS stands for per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. And what makes these chemicals unique is that they have this chain of fluorine-carbon bonds. These fluorine-carbon bonds are incredibly difficult to break, and this stability means that they remain in the soil and the water for decades, and thus there's many sites across the US as well as in Europe where their water is contaminated with high levels. In addition to water sources, PFAS chemicals are used in food and bakery items, stain-resistant, waterproof clothing, and some personal care products and cosmetics. And the human body also has a hard time eliminating them, so they accumulate in the body. This structure is similar to phospholipids, which are kind of fatty acid. So they also mimic other molecules in the body. And typically when a chemical is harmful, it's because your body thinks it's something else, and this triggers some sort of biological response. So studies have shown several different PFAS can disrupt normal reproductive function in women through altering hormone secretion, menstrual cyclicity, and fertility. And so these authors summarized over 150 scientific articles on PFAS and women's health, and they found that PFAS can target several different endpoints. They can disrupt normal reproductive function by direct interaction with ovary, uterus, developing embryo, or indirectly through targeting other endocrine tissues. So as you can see from this figure, the specific PFAS chemicals are colored with reported positive associations in red, negative associations in blue, or mixed associations in purple. For example, over here, you can see PFAS, PFOA, and PFNA in blue. And this means that higher exposure to these chemicals are linked with earlier age at menopause. And over here, you see PFOA in red, which means that increased PFOA exposure is linked with increased risk of ovarian risk. There are a few large studies interested in the role of PFAS chemicals on menstrual cycle length and regularity. So menstrual cycle length is an indicator of reproductive health. A menstrual cycle includes two phases. There's a follicular phase and a luteal phase, and they're characterized by these distinct sort of hormonal patterns that are going up and down at different distinct times during the menstrual cycle. So the menstrual cycle length can be thought of as this metric of a cumulative exposure to ovarian steroids. And when it's altered to shorter, longer, or erratic, menstrual cycle length can be considered sort of a risk factor or a symptom of reproductive diseases and disorders. And in 3 studies that included several hundred to over 1,000 women, depending on the specific PFAS chemical measured, whether the woman was taking hormonal contraceptives and other factors, PFAS chemicals had the potential to alter the length of the menstrual cycle or increase the irregularity of that cycle length. So risk factors of menstrual length are not limited to PFAS, and we know that stress and diet, for example, are established risk factors of altered menstrual cycles. In extreme conditions, elite athletes or high stress professions, or during war times, menstrual periods can actually completely stop. In addition, other chemicals such as metals and endocrine disrupting chemicals have been linked with altered menstrual length. So in one example, researchers looked at populations of women ages 19 to 42 years in 2 remote Cree Free Nation communities in subarctic Canada. Though the study size was small because the population of these people was also relatively small, in about 50 women, they found that higher exposures of PPDEs, which is a fire retardant, cadmium, and selenium, were linked with decreased menstrual cycle length, whereas increased menstrual cycle length was associated with higher concentrations of copper. And this supports that menstruation and endocrine function are highly influenced by the environment. So the data I just showed you demonstrated that steroid and hormone profiles are important in established menstrual cycles. Similarly, the menopause transition, as Ronit described, is this natural progressive decline in fertility and marked by the depletion of ovarian reserve over women's reproductive lifetime. And this transition is also associated with hormonal changes. So similar to the PFAS I just described that mimic fatty acids, chemicals either from food or the environment that mimic hormones or block natural hormones from doing their job are likely candidate toxicants related to women's reproductive health. And on this slide, I'm showing you a class of chemicals called endocrine disrupting chemicals, or EDCs, that were mentioned by Ronit and also by Dr. Wright earlier. And these include PFAS, but they also include cigarette smoke, PCBs, phthalates, bisphenols, pesticides, and the PBDEs, or the flame retardants that I mentioned in the previous study. And these chemicals are found in different sources, so people are exposed in several ways, including the air we breathe, the food we eat, and the water we drink, and they can also enter through the skin. So recent data suggests exposure to certain EDCs may accelerate reproductive aging and contribute to earlier onset of menopause. In this study, data was collected from the National Health Nutrition Examination Survey, or NHANES, from 1999 to 2008. And this included over 30,000 menopausal women over 30 years of age. So in these women, 35 EDC chemicals were measured in blood or urine that was collected at the time of the survey, where they reported age at menopause. And the authors found that there were 9 PCBs, 3 pesticides, and 2 phthalates that were significantly associated with earlier age of menopause, with menopause occurring as much as 3.8 years earlier in women with the highest levels of EDCs. And so these results suggest that several EDC classes of chemicals, possibly through several mechanisms, have the potential for untoward reproductive consequences. So another class of EDC chemicals, or phthalates, have also been implicated in sleep disturbances and hot flashes in mid-age women, 2 symptoms that women in the reproductive stage and perimenopause commonly experience. So in the Midlife Women's Health Study of 744 premenopausal and perimenopausal women aged 45 to 54, they looked at associations between levels of different phthalate chemicals measured in urine and self-reported hot flash outcomes 1 to 4 years later. And they found that the increased sum of phthalates that are specifically found in plastics were associated with higher frequency of hot flash. In another study, researchers were interested in whether phthalate exposures can affect sleep quality. They recruited 27 midlife women, ages 45 to 54, that were premenopausal, perimenopausal, and postmenopausal. And they collected urine to measure phthalates. And they used surveys and smartwatches to monitor their sleep for 7 nights. And they found that women with higher phthalate exposure have reduced sleep quality, more frequent sleep disruptions, and more restless sleep compared to women with lower exposures. So there's only a few studies to date on phthalates in particular and on environmental factors in general that are linked to menopause symptoms. However, since these hormonal fluctuations that we keep discussing are a potential biological mechanism of many menopause symptoms, more studies are needed to explore these relationships between exposures and menopause symptoms. Finally, we all know that air pollution has many adverse health effects, with those in the related to cardiovascular system being the most well studied. Air pollution is a complex mixture of particulate matter of different sizes, organic compounds, and volatile gases. The most commonly studied are traffic-related air pollutants, and these include particulate matter, or PM, that is 2.5 microns in diameter or smaller, and that's called PM 2.5. There's also NO2 and ozone, which is O3. So in human studies, air pollution is linked to changes in oxidative stress and inflammation in the body. And this recognition of the general adverse health impacts of air pollution has really stimulated several large studies on the impacts of air pollution on women's health. These studies on women from reproductive age to postmenopause suggest that NOx exposure is associated with increased stroke. PM 2.5 is associated with accelerating the development of atherosclerosis and also associated with decreased ovarian reserve. PM 2.5 and NO2 are associated with earlier age of menopause, while ozone is associated with later age of menopause, and several air pollutants are associated with decreased bone density. And so these studies support the role of air pollution as a risk factor for adverse reproductive and healthy longevity in women. And interestingly, suggest that there's other toxins beyond endocrine disrupting chemicals that may be important. So these emerging studies suggest that there is the potential for many different chemicals to act in tandem during a woman's life course to adversely affect her health in midlife. The exposome concept captures this. It's the idea that we want to measure all of the exposures in the body throughout the life transition in order to understand the multifactorial causes of disease. Practically, we break this down into the external exposome and the internal exposome. The external exposome includes environmental exposures that we're most used to hearing about, things like air pollution, exposures through the food we eat and the vitamins and prescription drugs we take, also like PFAS and EDCs that we talked about. We also have lifestyle factors such as exercise or cigarette smoking, stress factors, exposures to infections. These chemicals can enter our body and circulate in our blood and our tissues. And these circulating chemicals can interact with our biology in combination with those other factors like BMI, current or past disease status, sex and ethnicity to change our molecular readouts. This is the internal exposome. So we can measure thousands of biological markers that reflect the effects of exposures on our body at any given point in time. Since understanding how exposures impact health is so important, then practically, how do we measure the exposome? And so one technology that's been developed in the last decade is using untargeted assays to measure metabolite profiles called metabolomics. An assay is a laboratory test, and untargeted means that we don't have a hypothesis. Instead, we're going to let the data do the talking and measure as many metabolites and circulating exposures as we can in a biological specimen like blood or urine. And so this is a really powerful approach. And I sort of illustrate this here. So we use advanced technology to measure 10,000 signals of circulating chemicals and metabolites in a small volume of blood or urine. Metabolites that are measured include things like amino acids, fatty acids, and hormones, many of the chemicals that you may think of when you do a normal blood workup. However, my untargeted assay also measures these and 10,000 other chemicals, including acetaminophen, caffeine, phthalates, PFAS, and more. And I look for unique exposures or unique exposure levels that may help us understand the causes of disease. So I'd like to link this to one area of women's health where I've started to do some research, which is in postpartum depression. So pregnancy and the first year after childbirth present many challenges, including an increased risk for onset or worsening of mood disorders, and is the top complication of pregnancy and childbirth. Indeed, postpartum depression, or PPD, affects 13% of women after childbirth in high-income countries and 20% in low and middle-income countries. And so as a result of PPD, other co-occurring maternal conditions include impaired quality of life and a range of adverse maternal health outcomes. But what causes PPD and how it develops is not yet understood. So while other researchers have seen associations between air pollution exposures and depression in adults, our team at Mount Sinai was one of the first to look at the effects of air pollution during pregnancy as a particularly vulnerable window of exposure sensitivity to develop postpartum depression. One of those windows that Dr. Wright had described earlier. In this cohort of women in the Boston area of Massachusetts, they found that PM 2.5 exposure during mid-pregnancy increased the risk of depression symptoms at 6 to 12 months postpartum. So we wanted to explore this further in a cohort of women in Mexico City that have been followed since 2009. And this is the progress cohort, and these women are exposed to dense traffic and industry, which contribute to poor air quality. And this is made worse by the fact that the city sort of lies within a valley that traps this air pollution. And so this results in higher average PM 2.5 levels than those that are typically observed in the US, and higher than the women in the Boston area that I just described. And so this gives us the ability to see stronger associations with smaller sample numbers. So we use the EPDS, or the Edinburgh Postnatal Depression Scale, which is similar to the screener that is now given to almost all women postpartum in the US to test for depression. It's a 10-question screener that assesses self-blame, the ability to feel enjoyment, anxiety, sadness, and self-harm. And we then analyzed if there's a link between PM 2.5 exposure levels and the women during pregnancy and their risk of postpartum. So we found that higher PM 2.5 exposures during pregnancy increase the risk of having postpartum depression at 6 months by 60%. Further, we saw that for mothers who didn't already have depression at 1 month, that risk of having new onset postpartum depression at 6 months was increased to 158%. So our next question was, how mechanistically might PM 2.5 exposure affect postpartum depression? And to answer this, we used metabolomics. We performed a preliminary metabolomic study in the progress cohort to unravel potential biological pathways linking PM 2.5 exposure and PPD. So in a small subset of the progress mothers, we performed this metabolomics profiling of blood that was collected during the 2nd trimester and the 3rd trimester. And metabolites significantly linked to PM 2.5 exposure are indicated in these blue circles in each of the trimesters. So we found one metabolite, itaconate, that was linked with both 2nd and 3rd trimester PM 2.5 exposures, and also linked with postpartum depression at 6 months. Since itaconate is an anti-inflammatory metabolite, this suggests that inflammation may be a pathway linking PM 2.5 exposure during pregnancy and postpartum depression. And so this is just preliminary data and a starting point, but we're excited about continuing this research to understand the environmental factors linked with depression in women. So one major challenge that has hindered women's health study is timing. As I showed in an earlier slide, sex hormones fluctuate with menstrual cycles. Therefore, in order to accurately investigate the different phases of the menstrual cycle, researchers need to know when each cycle ends and when each cycle begins. And they do that through a combination of daily biomarker measurements that track that rise and fall of the series of hormones over the course of the menstrual cycle. And because of this complexity, it wasn't until 2017 in the SWAN cohort that menstrual cycle hormone patterns in women as they approach menopause were robustly characterized. So prior to this, there were only small studies or data was only collected at limited time points. And in the SWAN study, they enrolled over 900 women. At the start of the study, women collected their first morning urines, and they did this daily for one complete menstrual cycle or 50 days, whichever came first. And these collections were repeated once a year until they had their final menstrual period or up to 10 years later. And so this graph shows the percent of women who experienced normal cycles of luteal activity, or the surge in LH and FSH that's expected during the menstrual cycle. And so that's in black. And those without this normal activity is in gray. And you can sort of see this drastic increase in the gray bars starts at around 5 years before the final menstrual period, or FMP, on the graph. And this corresponds with that time frame I mentioned in one of the first slides, that women report experiencing perimenopausal symptoms years before menopause. So these basic female processes have made studying females' physiology challenging due to the strict timing of repeated sampling that's needed. However, hormone profiles are very important to consider, as we mentioned, because we know that many exposures, particularly those like EDCs, may be risk factors for adverse health outcomes through altering these hormone profiles. So we need alternative approaches to complement our traditional collections of urine and blood. And so here on the left, I'm showing you a device that I work with to collect blood from a heel or finger prick, which is just for through a lancet. And these can be collected at home and mailed in. So you can imagine being able to more easily collect repeated samples over a menstrual cycle. These can be combined with sort of low-cost bracelets like the silicone ones you see here, and they absorb chemicals that we can then measure using our untargeted instruments. So together, we can capture diet, exposures, hormone profiles, and biological responses using these minimally invasive sampling techniques that can be measured with our untargeted assays. So using these techniques and the power of metabolomics, we can understand how exposures and hormonal changes work in concert to modify menopausal transition. So to summarize, I hope that I've demonstrated that there are many environmental factors associated with adverse reproductive health in women, including menopausal timing, ovarian reserve, menstrual cycle irregularity, and menopause symptoms. And given the breadth of potential exposures and contributing factors such as BMI, diet, stress, and others, an exposome approach is needed to investigate women's reproductive aging across exposures and across endpoints. I think that these novel exposome devices are needed to investigate these time-sensitive windows and increase our understanding of the complexity involved in women transversing menopause. So to finish up, in the last 1 to 2 years, there's this increasing public interest in understanding women's health in midlife. And this is 10 to 15 years of a woman's life where the changing environment can adversely affect reproductive health, and has inspired me and others to better understand and identify risk factors. So I think that we're at an exciting beginning, and further studies are needed to examine the effects of these exposures involved in the onset and the acceleration of reproductive disorders in women. And I think that exposomics approaches, such as untargeted assays, as well as many other omics together, can play an important role in uncovering these modifiable risk factors that may decrease a woman's quality of life and increase a woman's risk of long-term pathologies such as depression, cancer, metabolic diseases, osteoporosis, and cardiovascular disease. And I think I'll stop there. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Petrick. So at this time, we're going to take questions from the audience. So I will call our panelists back. so that we can address some of the really great questions that have come in and unpack some of all of that really excellent information that you just shared with us. So I think that you both really clearly showed that there's good evidence that the environment impacts reproductive health across the lifespan. And so what I'm curious to know is whether you've seen changes in reproductive health outcomes over time over the last 50 to 75 years, where we've seen an entry of many more chemicals into our environment. How have these reproductive outcomes changed over time?
Okay, so actually there are several papers, specifically in the last year, that there is a decrease in sperm volume and sperm quantity and quality. And seems that those are attributable to environment. Actually, it seems we see it mainly in the laboratory and not really clinically, because it seems that the percentage of infertility remains 15 years over decades. So that's a good thing. But it seems that that there are reserve in sperm quality, and that's why we don't see it clinically. But we are really worried that in some years, so we will start to see all those things also clinically.
Thank you. So we really heard a lot about stress and mental health from all three of you today. And there were questions that came in related to this area. Dr. Wright, you shared about how early life and prenatal exposures to stress can influence pregnancy outcomes and child health. Dr. Mochtinger, you talked about an increased risk of mood disorders during menopausal transition, which I thought was really interesting and compelling. And Dr. Petrick, you talked about the link between air pollutants and postpartum depression, which was something that I didn't know very much about. So my question is, what should practitioners do and clinicians do? Are they applying the knowledge that you're seeing in your research to clinical practice to take steps to improve mental health in these populations? And I guess anyone can, Dr. Mochtinger, maybe as a clinician, you could address how you handle that.
Sure. So I can talk more and more about things that are associated with reproduction and fertility, because we do know that there are several factors, like, for example, sugar beverages that are associated to decrease fertility or adverse IVF outcomes. So we tell the patients when they're coming and they're asking, they really want, to increase their chances to conceive. So we're talking about phthalates, bisphenol A, all those chemicals. For the menopause, I think that all this area of investigation is really at the beginning. So we are starting to collect in the last years more and more data about it. And also for clinicians, most of the OBGYNs until now. So we had we put a lot of time in reproduction, in high-risk pregnancy, in gynecology, but not in menopause. And only in the last 1, 2, 3 years, I think that we see more and more OBGYNs that specialize in menopause. And we really understand that we have to put more and more attention to this age group. And as a lot of patients are not really interested in taking hormones in their age 30, so my own opinions in the next years, women will ask more and more clinicians what I can do to change my environment to decrease my symptoms. So this is what I personally think.
Mm. Yeah, and as a quick follow-up to that, what do you recommend as safe treatments for many of the symptoms that menopausal women experience?
Okay, so this is really something that has to be tailored for each patient. When we start ART, the hormonal therapy, so we have to know the medical condition of each patient. Usually the best to start it is when she is perimenopause, or we have a window of 2 years since the beginning of menopause, because we know from the WHI studies that Dr. right, showed at the beginning of the talk, that was published about 20 years ago, that there was higher chance of a lot of DVT, cardiovascular disorders. And when all those things were revised, it seems that those patients started the hormonal therapy much later and not when they just entered the menopause. So for most of the women, we do recommend to have vaginal treatment of estrogen, which in a lot of places is over the counter. And the risk of it are very, very low, but it really helps all the vaginal atrophy and the genitourinary disorders. And for the HRT, it really depends on the symptoms of the patient. You know, if she has symptoms, so today, if she has like the vasomotor symptoms and sleep disturbances, especially the vasomotor symptoms, so usually it's good to consult with her doctor about getting HRT. For the sleep disturbances, we know that if she doesn't have anything else, so those hormones are not really helpful in most of the cases. But non-conventional therapy, as acupuncture and reflexology, sometimes also help to these symptoms for those who are not interested in hormones.
Thank you. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what some of you touched on in terms of the prenatal period and early life being a period that's particularly vulnerable to exposure to environmental chemicals like the endocrine disruptors that you talked about. And Dr. Mochtinger, you described how oocytes form in utero. And so that may set the stage for later life fertility. And I think maybe, Dr. Petrick, this is a question for you. And some of the research that you do, is it possible to connect those early life exposures to later life reproductive health in women? And how are you sort of going back in time to measure those early life exposures and link them to later life health outcomes?
Yeah, so I think that one way is to look for some of these biological samples that may have been collected around that time. So some of my work looks at using newborn dry blood spots, which are collected at the time of birth, and pretty much everyone in the US and most countries in Europe to test for different congenital diseases and disorders. But in a lot of places, these archive spots are archived, and so we can go back and actually collect those samples from a cohort and look at these measurements from birth and connect them to later. So example, there could be a cohort that's developed for ovarian cancer. And if these dry bloods have been stored in places like California, they've been archived since 1980s. So that means that there are going to be dry blood spots available from these women who may be diagnosed. Well, we can get that sample early from around birth and look for these exposures and how they might be associated. So that's one way that we can sort of go back in time. And I think, there's a lot of these cohorts, there's a lot of interest in focusing on the early time period as really important. And I think we can agree that there's a lot of exposures that happen that could program things for later on life. I think what's interesting is that there's potentially other exposure time periods, right? So we can think about, puberty as an exposure, a sensitive period. We can think about pregnancy as a sensitive exposure period. And I think those are studied less. And so I'd like to see some of these cohorts that started off as birth cohorts transitioning on, since there was a lot of scientific investment in these cohorts. Could we now switch gears a little bit and start monitoring these mothers and these women, because we have them as this rich and valuable resource and data already collected. So I'd like to see that too.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing opportunity. Dr. Wright, a question for you around the work that you do related to air pollution. We had a lot of questions related to what can we do, what should we avoid. I think air pollutants, and Dr. Petrick, your work touches on this too, air pollutants are a really challenging one at the individual level. So what guidance do you have for individuals on reducing their exposure to air pollutants? Oh, we can't hear you. Oh, Dr. Wright, we can't hear you. No.
Muted. I think I'm double muted.
That's good.
So air pollution, yeah, it's ubiquitous. It's out there. We need to breathe the air, depending on where you live. If you're living in an urban environment like Manhattan, there's a lot of traffic around. That's a source. There are other sources that you might have to live nearby. So one thing you can do as we educate people, where people are able, they can move to places where they can minimize risk. Or there are high pollutant days that you can understand and track and try to mitigate your risk by not, being out in those days. We do this a lot for people with chronic lung disease, for example. As a physician, a lung physician, you talk to people about those kinds of things because that can trigger their asthma or their emphysema, et cetera. But I want to get back to something I said earlier. We all talked mostly about risk, right? Identifying risk factors and using bigger and bigger data to do that in a more comprehensive way. But there are resiliency factors we can understand in that data at the same time. Health, and I talk to my patients about that a lot of times, health is really an optimal balance, right? Keeping yourself in some optimal balance. We all know our own mental health is better when we feel our life is in balance. Like, yeah, we have challenges, but we're managing those challenges and we have the ability to cope with those challenges, et cetera. Similar to your body works that same way. And the signals that Dr. Petrick was showing us that she can get from these big data assays, you can actually look at networks and see what's being protective for these outcomes that we're looking at the same time that you're looking at the profiles that might show risk. And what are some of the things we might look for? Nutrient, the micronutrients that are in our body from the foods that we take in and eat. So high antioxidant intakes might offset things like air pollution. Air pollution, and Dr. Petrick showed a slide where she said it can cause oxidative stress. So if you eat antioxidants, and you might be able to get to a place where you can offset that. Similarly, psychological stress is a pro-oxidant, so you can do it as well. So there are things we can do, other things. So I think Dr. Mackinger mentioned alternative things, flexology and some other things. There are ways we can reduce stress, manage stress, increase social connectedness. Those get under our skin as well, and they can actually be a protective factor that move our hormonal panel profile in a more positive way, for example. So we should do a whole talk someday on just the resiliency factors, because we always kind of, people leave probably a little bit unsettled. Wow, what can I do about that? Well, there's a lot we can do, and there's a lot that we already are doing that we know can bring this into a better balance. That's how we live in the world, and that's why we're not all sick all the time. We are able to balance. So,
right, and there may be many protective factors that counteract our exposure to chemical toxicants and such. So, Dr. Mackinger, what advice would you give to women who are sort of in that early menopausal period? Age 40 to 50, I think it's a challenging time to take care of your health in that sort of sandwich generation as a caregiver, sometimes to children and aging parents. So is there something that you would say is the most important thing that women in that period of life should do to protect their health?
So I think it's very important, to do sport, not to smoke, to eat healthy, really to care about the weight, because when we get older, especially perimenopause and menopause, so our metabolism decreases, and it seems that for the same calories that we usually eat, so we start to gain weight, although it's something that we weren't used to. So some of the papers are talking about eating less 300 calories per day if you really want to keep your weight or to increase your sports. so to physical activity. Less sugar, and really, to be aware of yourself, to do routine checkup, mammography, if you're 40 or more, or have a family history of breast cancer or colon cancer. So it's really important to update your physician, blood pressure, glucose, so to keep healthy.
Thank you. So I think as we're coming close on time, there are additional questions about avoiding some of these chemical exposures, which is sometimes easier said than done. And so you all talked about endocrine disrupting chemicals. Maybe Dr. Petrick, you could talk a little bit more about some of the major sources for those endocrine disruptors. I know that we have a link in the chat to some of our educational resources around avoiding those exposures. But what are the sort of like key exposures, and how can people avoid them in their daily lives?
Yeah, so I mean, we can't completely eliminate these exposures. They're everywhere. They're part of our life, and there's many that we don't have control over. There's certain things that, I do in my house, for myself, for my family. And, they're the same things and the same education that we've been thinking about when we think about our children's health. But in this context, we need to remember that, we want to think about our own health too, right? It wasn't just during pregnancy and thinking about our children, but thinking about our reproductive health as we're aging. And so, it's things like not using plastic containers in the microwave, right? So that they don't leach out chemicals. Use glass if you can. Not to use some of the really hard plastic containers that they contain some chemicals that leach out. But if you need to, use some of the softer ones. And there's certain ratings of plasticware that you can find on websites like the Environmental Working Group that are better than others. You can use filtered water. I think, you can look up and find out near you if there's any PFAS specific concerns in your area. So there's lots of maps now available online, but if you're not even able to access that, we use filtered water to drink, and we use filtered water for our cooking. And so I think that's another way to sort of reduce some of your, potential PFAS exposures. And little simple things. I know there used to be, if people are treating their lawns with different sort of pesticides or treating their pets, there's other alternatives. There used to be these chemicals you had to, put it on your dog's back of your neck. And instead now there's sort of tablets you can give them. So you're not sitting there breathing these type of exposures and have, as your dog lays next to your bed at night, that it's, giving you these or your family. So I think these are, some of the activities that we try to do in our family to reduce our different exposures to these EDCs and PFAS chemicals.
Great, thank you. So as we wrap up, I also want to mention that I think the research that you all are doing and that's coming out of the Institute for Exposomics Research has also really informed policy change, so that it shifted the burden away from the individual to have to seek out, sources to educate themselves on product choice, while we're seeing, a lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals come out of products, and PFAS chemicals be restricted and so on. So I think the policy approach has really been informed by research, and that's great. So just as a final wrap up, one more question for Dr. Wright. I wanted to know, what do you feel most optimistic about as you see this research move forward?
I think it really is to underscore that, I've known over my entire career that we need to do what we're doing today with big data in the context of understanding some of these complex health issues, including women's health issues, which, as we've underscored, is widely understudied. And the tools and the technology and the workforce are here. They're here now. We're going to discover more. We're going to optimize those technologies even more. We're going to get bigger and bigger data. I think on the patient side, on the community side, we need to talk to folks about why we need that data? Why is that important? Why is it that we need during particular critical windows as well? And then we need to educate clinicians on the other side and help them develop ways that they can digest it, use it in the clinic. And we have to work more towards that, I think. But now is the time. I think we're at just an exciting inflection point. I think that others have underscored as we've talked today. And that's not hype. We are. And it's been exciting to be a part of what that means right now here at Sinai, but it's going to be even more exciting over the next 5 or 10 years. And we're going to have answers. We're going to have more answers, more and more answers for people when these questions, your questions come up. Many good questions today. But do look at some of the materials that are in the chat for the educational materials. There's a lot there that can go deeper than what we've been able to talk about today, for sure. But, this is where medicine is heading. It's great to see environment and on the big scale of exposomics coming into medicine. That's what needs to happen, married with genomics and genetics and all the advances we've made there, as we talked about earlier. So it's going to be incredible to see where this goes.
Well, thank you so much. Thanks to all of our speakers and to our audience for this engaging discussion. You can use the link in the chat to complete a brief survey to let us know what you thought of today's webinar. And if you'd like more information about exposomics, environmental exposures and health, what you can do to reduce exposures, and any upcoming events, please visit our website and follow us on social media at Sinai Exposomics. Have a great day, everyone.